The son of a tractor driver gave his last $50 to a poor orphan and forgot about it forever. 20 years later, when heavy trouble came to his house, a stranger in an expensive suit appeared on the doorstep, and as soon as the man realized who it was, he froze in amazement. Dear friends of the Stories and Destinies channel, before we continue, right where you are watching us from, enjoy the listening. Arthur lowered the lid of the wooden box with a dull thud. The past would not let go. It lived in every corner of this apartment, in every floorboard, in old, carefully preserved things. In 1985, Blackwood met him with the deafening roar of car engines and the clanging of trams. After the drawing, ringing silence of his native village, Little Springs, this noise was deafening, but at the same time it poured some unprecedented, daring energy into his veins. Arthur, a sturdily built guy with heavy hands accustomed to peasant labor, stood in the station square and greedily inhaled the air of the big city. It smelled of hot asphalt, gasoline fumes, and sweet pastries from a nearby stall. His father saw him off curtly, thrusting rolled-up bills into his jacket pocket, patted him on the shoulder and grunted, "Look, Arthur, the city does not forgive weakness. Do not shame our kin." Arthur did not intend to yield to difficulties. He got a job at the leather plant in the primary processing shop. The work was hard, exhausting. In the huge brick hangar, there was a thick, heavy spirit of raw hide and chemical reagents. From the monotonous hum of industrial centrifuges, his ears were blocked by the end of the day. During a shift, he carried quintals of cargo on his shoulders. But in the evenings, returning to the factory dormitory, Arthur experienced a strange, ringing joy. He was earning his first real city money and felt how firmly he stood on his feet. In the autumn, the shift turned out to be especially grueling. Arthur took 2 overtime shifts in a row to save up for a good winter coat. He entered the shuttle bus, barely moving his legs, which were leaden from fatigue, sank onto a hard leatherette seat by the window, leaned his temple against the cold glass, vibrating slightly from the engine's work, and instantly fell into a heavy slumber. Through his sleep he heard the stops being announced dully, the doors sliding open with a hiss. "Young man, wake up." The voice was quiet, but somehow surprisingly resonant, like the clink of a silver spoon against a crystal glass. Arthur started, with difficulty opening his eyelids. A girl was standing over him. In the dim light of the interior lamps, her blonde hair seemed almost transparent. She wore a simple cloth coat, neatly buttoned up to the top, and the edge of a knitted woolen scarf peeked out from under the collar. There was a faint scent of lilac, the simplest toilet soap, coming from her. Short-statured, she tilted her head slightly to the side, carefully studying his sleepy face. "You usually get off 2 stops earlier," I noticed. Arthur blinked in confusion, chasing away the remnants of sleep. His throat was dry from breathing through his mouth for a long time. "I overslept." "Thank you." "And how do you know?" "We travel the same route." She smiled, and this smile turned out to be so warm, apologetic, as if she felt awkward for disturbing his peace. "I work at the garment factory, the building next to your plant." The bus jerked and braked. Arthur rose abruptly, almost hitting his head on the top handrail. "Arthur." He held out his broad palm, immediately embarrassed by its roughness, next to this fragile fellow traveller. "Clara." She cautiously shook his hand. Her fingers were cool and thin. That evening he went to see her off to the women's dormitory. The frosty air was bracing. The first timid ice, which had tightened the deep puddles, crunched under his heavy boots. They walked slowly, bypassing the sections of the street lit by dim yellow lanterns. "And I'm from Little Springs," Arthur told her, hiding his chilled hands deep in his jacket pockets. "Recently in the city, still can't get used to the fact that the sky is bright at night from the lanterns. Stars are not visible at all. Clara listened attentively, occasionally nodding in time with his steps. "And I never counted the stars," she said quietly, looking at her feet. "I grew up in an orphanage. The windows of our bedroom faced the blank brick wall of the neighboring building. Only one lantern shone directly into the glass there." Arthur stopped. The girl's words echoed inside with a strange, deep resonance. He looked at her profile, softly outlined by the light of the street lamp, and suddenly realized a perfectly clear thought. He wants to build a house for her, where the boundless sky will be visible in every window. They got married 6 months later, without fanfare, without magnificent celebrations and noisy feasts. They registered at the district registry office one frosty February morning. Clara was wearing an elegant light dress sewn by herself at the factory after shifts. Arthur wore his only Sunday suit. In the evening, several factory comrades gathered in a cramped dormitory room, put boiled potatoes, pickles, and simple homemade snacks on the table. Arthur's father did not come to the city, citing being busy during preparations for the sowing season, but sent a postal order for $30. Very, very solid money for a village resident in those times. Soon the young couple moved into a tiny one-room apartment on the outskirts of Blackwood. They lived in perfect harmony. Arthur took any side job, lugged heavy boxes at the vegetable warehouse on weekends, just so his wife would not lack anything. Clara built their cozy nest with that frantic zeal inherent only to people who have never had their own corner. She starched the napkins, grew lush geraniums on the windowsill, and met her husband every evening with a hot dinner. 2 years later, Daisy was born. The girl was born tiny, but demanding and vocal. Arthur, taking this weightless, warm bundle in his arms for the first time, felt how all his previous ideas about the world collapsed inside him. He looked at the tiny face that inherited the soft features of the mother and understood. Here is the absolute meaning of his existence. The days flowed in a succession of cares and quiet family joys, but gradually this bright idol began to be covered by a dark, invisible shroud. Clara began to tire quickly. More and more often, Arthur found her pale, sitting on the edge of a stool in the kitchen, her arms tightly crossed over her stomach. "Clara, you should go to the doctor," he said, lowering a heavy bag of groceries to the floor. "There hasn't been a face on you for 3 days." Clara immediately straightened up, pulling on her signature warm smile. "Nonsense, Arthur. Just the gastritis acting up. Ate something wrong in the canteen. I brewed a chamomile decoction yesterday. Already easier. Don't invent problems where there are none." She masterfully changed the subject, began to bustle at the stove, rattle the plates, ask about affairs at the plant, and Arthur retreated. He believed her calm tone, her confident movements. One day, returning from a shift earlier than usual due to a breakdown of the conveyor belt, Arthur quietly turned the key in the lock. A viscous, heavy silence stood in the apartment. He went into the kitchen and froze in the doorway. Clara was standing at the sink, convulsively clutching the edge of the countertop with whitened fingers. Her back was shaking slightly and rhythmically. "Clara!" he called loudly, taking a decisive step forward. She turned sharply, but large drops of sweat glittered on her forehead. Her breathing was frequent and shallow, as if she lacked air. "Nothing," she whispered quickly, trying to portray ease, but her lips trembled treacherously. "Just a little pain. It will pass now." Arthur came close and resolutely took her by the shoulders. Under the thin fabric of her house blouse, he felt how fragile, almost weightless, she had become in recent months. "Get ready. We're going to the hospital right now." A genuine animal horror flashed in Clara's eyes. She pulled away, shaking her head negatively. No, no hospitals, Arthur. I beg you. It's long. It's a hassle. I'll take the pills. I can't be sick. Do you understand? I can't. Her voice broke into a desperate whisper. At that moment, it was not an adult woman, the mother of a family, speaking from her, but that same frightened girl from the orphanage who was terrified of becoming a burden to the point of madness. She was afraid that she would be given up if she turned out to be problematic. What are you talking about? You are my wife. Arthur tried to speak softly, but inside a dark, heavy foreboding of trouble was already growing rapidly. I'll manage myself, she cut off firmly, turning back to the sink and letting the ice-cold water run. The noise of the stream almost drowned out her next words, but Arthur read them from her hunched posture. I don't want you and Daisy to mess with me. Arthur retreated then. It was his main, irreparable mistake. He believed in her imaginary strength, allowed her to deceive them both. Clara continued to take pain-killing powders bought at the nearest pharmacy, brewed bitter herbs, and every day, gritting her teeth, created the perfect illusion of a normal life. She managed to play with her daughter, sew outfits to order for familiar factory girls, cook thick, rich borscht, the aroma of which met Arthur even on the landing. But at night, through his light sleep, he heard how she quietly, so that the bed would not creak, got up and went to the kitchen. There she sat for a long time in complete darkness. The spring of 1992 was approaching. The winter that year turned out to be long, mean, with biting winds and endless blizzards that covered the streets of Blackwood with delicate dunes. On one of these grey, chilly mornings, Clara could not get up. Arthur woke up to the fact that it was frighteningly quiet in the apartment. Usually by this time, his wife was already bustling in the kitchen, clinking dishes and quietly humming something to herself. Clara was lying on her back, unnaturally straight. Her face, always so alive and expressive, now resembled a frozen mask. Her breathing was barely perceptible, intermittent. Clara, Arthur carefully touched her hand. The skin was icy and unpleasantly damp. She opened her eyes with great difficulty. There was such a bottomless, exhausting torment in them that Arthur involuntarily recoiled, knocking over a chair. Arthur! Her voice rustled like dry autumn leaves underfoot. An ambulance! Probably an ambulance is needed now. Panic covered him like a heavy, suffocating wave. He rushed into the cramped hallway with disobedient fingers, turned the phone dial, getting confused in the numbers, shouted the home address into the receiver to the dispatcher, faltering and repeating the same thing several times. Returning to the room, he knelt before the bed. In the next room, 4-year-old Daisy woke up and cried loudly. "Hang on, darling, they'll be here soon," Arthur whispered, desperately rubbing his wife's icy palms, trying to return warmth to them. "The doctors will help. We'll get you back on your feet quickly." Clara shook her head weakly. She looked at him so clearly and consciously, as if the physical pain had retreated for a moment, leaving room only for the bitter acceptance of the inevitable finale. On the dresser, she whispered barely audibly with her lips, "Under the napkin is a letter." "What letter, Clara?" "Later, everything later." Arthur stroked her tangled hair, refusing to understand the terrible meaning of her words. She closed her eyes, and that same familiar to the smallest detail apologetic smile appeared on her pale lips. The smile of a person who feared more than anything in the world to cause inconvenience to those they love. Ambulance doctors, heavy men in jackets made of thick, damp cloth, entered the room with a heavy stomp. The sharp, nostril-stinging smell of camphor and alcohol instantly displaced the cozy home spirit of fresh pastries that Clara had so diligently maintained all these years. The senior paramedic, a gloomy man with thick eyebrows, leaned over the bed. The metal lock of the medical bag clinked. Arthur stood at the doorframe, feeling the tips of his fingers go numb. In the next room, 4-year-old Daisy sat on the rug in a flannel dress and quietly sorted through wooden blocks. The girl did not understand why strangers appeared in the house, but instinctively hid, listening to the muffled voices of the adults. The paramedic straightened up, pulling off his rubber gloves with a characteristic, dry snap. He looked at Arthur with a heavy, dark gaze in which a sentence was read. "Too late, landlord," the doctor said hollowly. Peritonitis by all appearances, a neglected ulcer, or something worse. Why wasn't she taken to the hospital? She must have been burning with such pain for weeks. The words hit like a backhand. Arthur slowly sank onto a stool, rubbing his hard palms into his knees with force. Why didn't he take her? Because he believed her soft voice. Because he allowed himself to be deceived by a traumatized orphanage girl who preferred to leave in silence rather than become a burden to him. This guilt lay on Arthur's shoulders like a cast-iron slab, and he realized that now he would have to carry this weight to the very end. 3 days after the quiet, sparsely attended funeral, when the neighbors from the factory stopped bringing memorial pies and sympathetic looks into the house, Arthur was left alone with the empty apartment. He went to the dresser. Under the lace-starched napkin really lay a thick paper envelope. Arthur took it in his hands. The paper retained the light scent of lilac soap, the smell of Clara. He ran his thumb along the glued edge. Inside, her truth was hidden. Her last thoughts, her apologies which he did not deserve to hear because he did not protect her. In his head, an old proverb sounded which his father often repeated in Little Springs. A sword does not strike a bowed head. But it seemed to Arthur that every word in this letter would become that very sword. He did not open the envelope, hid it at the very bottom of the wooden box with documents, pushing it into the far corner of the closet. 3 years passed. In 1995, Blackwood, like the whole country, was going through hard times. The plant was in fever, wages were paid with delays, but Arthur held on to his place in the shop with a death grip. Daisy grew into a bright, quiet girl. Her father guarded her with a frightening, painful persistence. He saw her off to the very doors of the kindergarten, personally checked that the buttons on her coat were fastened to the very chin, and flinched at every light cough of hers. The fear of losing his daughter as suddenly as Clara firmly settled in his mind. An October evening turned out to be damp. Arthur was riding from a shift in a half-empty bus. Dim lanterns and grey facades of panel houses flashed behind the muddy, dirt-splattered glass. The interior smelled of gasoline fumes and dampness. The man sat with his eyes closed, listening to the strained hum of the engine when he felt a light touch on the sleeve of his work jacket. He opened his eyes. A boy of about 10 was standing nearby. The child was wearing a dark blue canvas windbreaker, a couple of sizes larger than needed, from under which the collar of a checked shirt was visible. The boy stood straight, shifting from foot to foot, in worn-out shoes. "Uncle!" The child's voice sounded quiet, but without groveling. He looked directly into Arthur's face with serious and unchildlike sharp eyes. "Please give me $50. I'm very ashamed to ask, but there is no food at home at all. Mother and father have been partying for 3 days. Arthur straightened up. He looked at the boy's pale face, at his thin neck sticking out of the wide collar. In his memory, Clara suddenly surfaced, telling about the empty corridors of the orphanage and the constant background feeling of hunger that cannot be silenced by anything. The man silently reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, took out his wallet. There was the last money before the advance, set aside for new winter boots for Daisy. Arthur pulled out a $50 bill and handed it to the boy. Then he opened his canvas backpack, took out a sweet bun with poppy seeds wrapped in waxed paper, which they gave in the factory canteen for tea, and put it on top of the money. "Take it, kid, and take the bread too," Arthur said in a bass voice, watching the boy carefully take the food and money. The child tightly squeezed the bill in his fist and carefully hid the bun inside his wide jacket. "Thank you. I will definitely return the debt. I am Elias. I remembered you." The bus opened its doors at the stop with a hiss. The boy quickly ducked out into the street, vanishing into the evening twilight and the veil of light drizzling rain. Arthur only shook his head, seeing him off with a glance. What kind of debts can a child from a dysfunctional family have? The main thing is that he ate today. He turned away from the window, anticipating how in half an hour he would open the door of his apartment, how Daisy would run out to meet him in her slippers, and the world would narrow again to the size of their small but safe fortress. Arthur did not yet know that this chance meeting, lasting no more than a minute, would turn his whole life upside down decades later. Time in Blackwood did not go, but relentlessly rolled forward like heavy cast-iron rollers at the leather plant. The year 2002 arrived. The city was changing rapidly. Neon signs of the first supermarkets flashed on the central streets. Strange boxes of cell phones increasingly flashed in the hands of passers-by, and old rattling trams gradually gave way to nimble and noisy shuttle taxis. But inside Arthur's apartment, time seemed to freeze in thick, transparent amber. Daisy had turned into a real beauty. At 15, she was surprisingly similar to the late Clara. The same fragility of shoulders, the same soft oval of the face, and light, almost transparent hair. But her gaze was her father's, direct, firm, and deep. She grew up as a quiet, diligent girl whose world was limited by school, the library, and the walls of their small fortress. Arthur guarded her so fiercely that at times it resembled not care, but an unvoiced house arrest. "Dad, look what an evening it is today." Daisy stood at the window, her forehead pressed against the glass. "The girls from the class are all on the embankment. Can I, at least for half an hour, just walk to the park and back?" Arthur, sitting at the table, fixing an old kitchen mixer, did not even raise his head. The metal of the wrench chilled his fingers, and there was a sharp smell of plumbing grease and old rust in the air. "It's dark and damp in the park now, Daisy. Autumn twilights are deceptive. You'll catch a cold or, God forbid, meet someone unkind. Sit at home. I'll finish this and we'll have tea together with cookies." Daisy did not answer anything. She only sighed barely perceptibly, and this sound echoed in Arthur's heart with sharp, prickly anxiety. He knew that his daughter was burdened by his care. He saw how she secretly looked at bright magazines with photos of distant cities, how enthusiastically she drew strange, futuristic buildings with huge windows in an album. But the fear was stronger. The echo of pain from the loss of his wife still buzzed in his ears, reminding him, one wrong decision and the world will collapse. To somehow make up for his severity, Arthur decided to give his daughter a gift she had dreamed of all summer. With his 13th salary and money saved over the year, he bought her a bicycle, a real modern one with a sparkling blue frame and many gears. On that Saturday evening when he triumphantly brought the bicycle into the hallway, Daisy laughed truly for the first time in a long while. The sound of her laughter was like the tinkling of crystal bells. She could not resist and impulsively hugged her father, burying her nose in his jacket that smelled of the shop. "Thank you, Dad. It's so beautiful. Can I try it tomorrow morning? Only in the yard, honestly." Arthur smiled, patting her on the shoulder with his broad palm. "Good, daughter. Tomorrow is Sunday. There are few cars. We'll go out together. I'll watch." The morning was transparent and quiet. The city was still asleep, covered in a light mist. Arthur sat on a bench by the entrance, watching Daisy confidently saddle her blue apparatus. She wore simple jeans and a thick flannel-checked shirt. No pretension, everything as her father liked. She slowly rode one lap around the yard, then another. The wind played with her hair, and an unprecedented thirst for freedom shone in her eyes. "Dad, I'll just go to the end of the street and back. It's very close here," she shouted, turning as she went. "Arthur, just don't go out on the road, do you hear? Be careful." She only waved her hand gaily and disappeared around the corner of the neighboring house. Arthur remained sitting on the bench. He felt the morning cold creeping under his sweater, the smell of rotting leaves and damp asphalt. Suddenly the silence of the Sunday morning was pierced by the screech of brakes. This sound, sharp, tearing space, similar to the cry of a wounded bird, made Arthur jump up. His heart skipped a beat and then began to beat frequently and heavily, echoing in his temples with dull sledgehammer blows. He rushed around the corner of the house, not feeling his legs beneath him. The world around seemed to fall apart into separate, sinister fragments. An overturned blue bicycle, whose front wheel continued to spin with a quiet, mocking clicking. A black foreign car with an open door. And her. Daisy lay on the asphalt, one leg unnaturally tucked under her. Her light hair was scattered over the grey canvas of the road, and her face was white as chalk. Daisy, Daisy. Arthur fell to his knees beside her. He was afraid to touch her, afraid to make it even worse. She did not scream. She looked at him with wide-open eyes full of misunderstanding. "Dad," she whispered, and there was no pain in her voice, only endless surprise. I don't feel my legs at all." 40 minutes later, the building of City Hospital No. D took them into its cold, tiled embrace. Arthur sat on a hard wooden chair under the operating room door, his fingers locked together. Every minute stretched like a whole hour. Nurses in starched robes passed by. Their steps echoed loudly off the walls, but Arthur saw no one. Before his eyes stood that same unopened box. "This is punishment," the only thought pounded in his head. This is for Clara, for not protecting her then, for loosening the grip now. The operating room door finally creaked. A surgeon came out, an elderly man with tired eyes and deep wrinkles on his forehead. He slowly pulled off his mask, and from his face, Arthur understood everything even before the first words were spoken. "Alive!" the doctor tossed curtly, sitting down on a nearby chair. "That's the main thing, but the spinal injury is very serious." "Arthur, what is your patronymic?" "Just Arthur," he responded hoarsely. "Will she walk?" "Doctor, there is a chance, but not here, in our city. We have done everything we could. A complex, reconstructive operation is needed, and then a long, very expensive rehabilitation in a specialized center, in the capital or abroad." "How much?" Arthur raised a heavy gaze to him. The doctor named an amount. The figure was so huge that Arthur did not even immediately realize its scale. For a person living from paycheck to paycheck, it was the price not just of an operation, it was the price of several lives. So much cannot be earned in 10 years, even if working 3 shifts without days off. "I understand," the surgeon said quietly, seeing how the man's face had grown thin. "But time is playing against you. The longer the spinal cord remains in such a state, the fewer chances for recovery of functions." Arthur was allowed into the ward only in the evening. Daisy lay under a white sheet, thin and transparent, as if made of the most fragile porcelain. The machines near the bed beeped steadily, marking the rhythm of her heart. When her father came closer, she opened her eyes. "Daddy, forgive me." Her voice was barely audible. I didn't want to upset you." Arthur carefully took her hand. Her fingers were warm, but there was no former strength in them. "Hush, daughter, everything will be fine. I'll think of something. Do you hear? I will definitely think of something." He said this confidently, but inside him was an icy void. He knew that the sale of their small apartment would cover only a small part of the costs, and he had nothing else. No connections, no wealthy relatives, no savings. That night Arthur did not return home. He sat on the hospital stairs, looking into the dark window. The city below shone with thousands of lights. Somewhere there people laughed, fell in love, made plans. And here, in the silence of the hospital corridor, the fate of his only meaning in life was being decided. And in this, "I wonder where he is now," Arthur thought. Is he alive? Did that 50 and the piece of bread help him then? He smiled bitterly at his thought. Kindness is not a bank deposit with interest. It is done just like that, into the void, and it's foolish to expect the world to return the debt to you exactly when you need it most. Arthur rose, squared his shoulders. He had a long, grueling battle for his daughter ahead. He did not yet know that ahead of him were 13 years of despair, work for wear and tear, and almost total loss of faith. 13 years is no small term. For a coastal stone, it is only a brief moment, unable to change its shape. But for a human destiny, a whole era, ruthlessly grinding youthful dreams into dust and erecting new blank walls. The year 2015 arrived. Blackwood expanded, grew with sparkling glass facades of shopping centres, and was girded by noisy car interchanges. However, the windows of the apartment on the first floor of the old brick house looked at this bustle with quiet, detached sadness. Arthur's room smelled of fresh drawing paper and strong brewed black tea with thyme. Daisy sat at a wide wooden table, bent low over a spread-out drawing paper. The girl turned 28. A wheelchair with shiny metal rims had long ceased to be perceived by her as an alien object, turning into an involuntary but familiar continuation of her body. A thin graphite lead left smooth, confident lines on the dazzling white sheet. The soft rustle of the pencil was interrupted only by the steady ticking of old wall clocks in the hallway. Daisy carefully placed a transparent plastic ruler to the edge of the drawing, checking the angle. She studied remotely, greedily absorbing knowledge at the Faculty of Architecture. The profession became for her not just a way to occupy endless hours in four walls, but a real life buoy. While her father disappeared at 2 jobs, trying to save a fantastic sum for an operation in a foreign clinic, Daisy built her own world. Amazing bright buildings were born on her drawings. In them, there were no steep spiral staircases, narrow doorways, or high, insurmountable thresholds. She designed a space where every person could move freely, gliding along smooth ramps, passing from bright galleries into spacious halls. This was her little secret. Hearing her father's heavy steps on the landing, she hastily covered her sketches of a barrier-free environment with blank sheets. The girl knew Arthur would perceive these drawings as her surrender, as a refusal to fight for recovery, and she had no right to take away his hope. The lock of the front door clicked. Daisy turned the wheels with a familiar movement, turning toward the sound. Arthur entered the hallway, bringing with him the smell of street dampness and gasoline fumes. He looked like a man carrying an invisible but incredibly heavy load on his shoulders. Grey hair finally displaced the dark colour from his hair, and deep and sharp shadows carved his face. He took off his damp jacket, hung it on an iron hook, and only after that went into the room. "Hello, Daisy." His voice sounded hollow, as if breaking through a thickness of cotton wool. "Hi, Dad, you're late today." Substituting for Simon again at the warehouse. She looked carefully at his hands. His fingers trembled slightly from overstrain. "Yes, delayed a bit. Inventory." Arthur sank heavily onto a chair opposite his daughter. "How is your progress? I see you're using up kilometers of paper again." Daisy smiled warmly, deftly putting pencils into a wooden case. "Architecture is frozen music, Dad. That's what Johann Wolfgang von Goethe said. And music must be written down accurately, otherwise it will be a cacophony." "I've brewed tea. Will you have some?" "I will, daughter, thank you." They sat in the tiny kitchen. Early autumn twilights were gathering outside the window. The yellow light of the lampshade highlighted the steam over the mugs and the faces of two people who loved each other immeasurably, but were divided by an invisible wall of mutual guilt. Arthur blamed himself for that fateful Sunday in 2002, when he allowed her to go out on the road. Daisy felt an eroding sense of shame for taking away her father's normal life, tying him to her wheelchair. This echo of pain hovered in the air, reflected in their every remark, in every cautious glance. Arthur sipped the hot tea, clasping the faience mug with both palms, as if trying to warm his frozen soul. "Called that clinic in Germany today," he said, looking out the darkening window. "They said, the bill is valid for another 3 months, then a recalculation. Prices are rising." Daisy quietly lowered the spoon onto the saucer. The thin porcelain ring seemed deafening in the silence. "Dad, please, let's stop. We've sold everything that had any value. You are working for wear and tear." "I'm doing perfectly fine. I have a profession. I have customers on the internet. It's convenient for me to live this way, really." Arthur slowly turned his head. In his darkened eyes, such a fierce, irreconcilable fire flared up that Daisy involuntarily shrank into her shoulders. "Don't you ever dare talk like that," he hissed through his teeth. Every word fell heavy and weighty like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. "As long as I breathe, I will look for this money." "You will walk with your own feet. I didn't have time to swear to Clara there in heaven, but I swear to you." The dispute that had flared up immediately died out, crushed by the years-long habit of protecting each other. Daisy fell silent, looking down at her motionless legs covered with a checked plaid. At that moment, a sharp, confident knock at the front door tore through the silence of the apartment. Not the short trill of the old electric bell, but exactly a knock with knuckles on the leatherette-covered surface. Arthur frowned. They were not expecting guests. Neighbors usually rang, and the mailman came in the mornings. He rose heavily, leaning his hands on the edge of the table, and went out into the hallway. The latch of the lock clicked. A man stood on the doorstep. He was about 30 years old, a perfectly tailored dark blue coat, and a faint scent of expensive perfume with notes of cedar and frosty freshness, impeccably polished leather shoes. His whole appearance contrasted sharply with the shabby walls of the entrance and the smell of basement dampness. "Good evening." The stranger's voice sounded deep and calm, but a barely restrained excitement was guessed in it. "You probably don't recognize me." Arthur shook his head negatively, squinting and carefully studying the guest. The face seemed completely unfamiliar, strong cheekbones, a straight nose, a confident set of shoulders, but the eyes. The look in these dark, sharp eyes seemed surprisingly familiar to Arthur, as if he had already seen them once long ago through a veil of rain and time. The young man did not wait for an answer. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, took out a thin leather wallet. His fingers, long and well-groomed, extracted a neatly folded banknote. He silently handed it to the owner of the apartment. Arthur automatically took the bill. It was an old, out-of-circulation purple paper. $50 from the 1993 model. In that same second, time seemed to make a giant leap back. The smell of expensive perfume was displaced by the aroma of gasoline fumes, and instead of an elegant man, Arthur suddenly clearly saw a thin, pale boy in a ridiculous, huge windbreaker before him. "Elias," Arthur exhaled. His voice trembled, losing all its stern firmness. "That kid from the bus." The man on the doorstep smiled warmly. The tension that fettered his shoulders instantly fell away. "Correct. I promised I would return the debt. True, I was delayed for 20 years. Will you let me in? There's a conversation." Arthur slowly, as if in a dream, retreated deep into the cramped hallway. The floorboards responded hollowly under the steps of the uninvited guest. Elias crossed the threshold, bringing with him the breath of a big, swift world, the smell of fresh evening wind, and a faint aroma of expensive leather. He carefully hung his coat on a massive iron hook next to the worn work jacket of the owner of the house. This contrast cut the eye, but for some reason did not cause rejection. "Go to the kitchen," Arthur said hoarsely, still clutching the old $50 bill in his hand like the greatest treasure. "We're just having tea." They walked down the narrow corridor. In the doorway of the kitchen, Elias froze. The yellow light of the lampshade fell on Daisy, illuminating her thin profile, her blonde hair scattered over her shoulders, and the shiny metal rims of the wheelchair. The girl just reached for a heavy kettle to add boiling water to her father's mug. The porcelain handle slipped out of her weakened fingers. The massive dish tilted dangerously. Elias was nearby in 2 quick, silent steps. His broad palm confidently intercepted the hot porcelain a second before the boiling water could spill onto Daisy's knees. "Allow me to help." His voice sounded soft, but with that firm confidence that does not tolerate objections. Daisy raised her head, and their eyes met. Elias expected to see a girl's eyes chained to a chair with faded submissiveness or prickly bitterness, but met a deep, clear light. In these eyes, the color of strongly brewed tea, a sharp mind, and hidden strength were read. The young man forgot for a moment why he came. He looked at the graceful line of her neck, at her thin wrists, and felt a strange, hot excitement rising inside. "Thank you," Daisy replied quietly, resting her hands on the checked plaid. "You're very timely." Elias poured the thick, fragrant drink into the mugs and sat down on a free stool. Arthur sat opposite, leaning his elbows heavily on the tabletop. The silence was broken only by a light whistle of wind behind the glass. 20 years have passed. Arthur broke the silence, carefully studying the guest. "I actually forgot to think about that meeting. A hungry kid in a bus. There were plenty of you like that wandering the streets then. How did you find me, and why were you looking?" Elias clasped the hot mug. The heat was transferred to his fingers, returning him to that chilly autumn evening of '95. "You gave me not just money then, Arthur. You gave me everything you had in your wallet and your dinner. I still remember that bun with poppy seeds. Its taste is the taste of hope. On that day, I decided that I would run away from my drinking parents. I realized that there are good people in the world, which means there is something worth climbing up for." He took a sip, gathering his thoughts. Daisy listened to him, holding her breath. In the cramped kitchen, the walls seemed to expand, letting in the story of someone else's overcoming. My aunt, my mother's sister Tasia, took me in. She arranged guardianship, pulled me out of that mud, gave me an education. I studied, opened my own business, logistics, transport shipping. A month ago I bought out the old bus park in Blackwood, and the first thing I did was pull up the archives of the old routes. I remembered at which stop you got on. I remembered the emblem of the leather plant on your jacket. Finding the lists of production veterans in the HR department was a matter of technique. Arthur shook his head. "Remarkable persistence. Well, you found me. Return the debt." He nodded at the old bill lying on the table. Thank you for the kind word, Elias. You honored the old man, but we are simple people. We don't need what's not ours. We've had tea. Now go in peace into your big life." Elias leaned forward slightly. Hard business notes sounded in his voice, behind which a huge emotional surrender was hidden. "I didn't come to drink tea or return old papers. When I was looking for your address, I made inquiries. Our town is still small, and medical records are in an electronic database now." Daisy straightened up abruptly in the chair. Her back tensed like a taut string. Arthur frowned his thick eyebrows. His face darkened instantly. "Where are you digging, kid?" the owner of the house said in a threateningly low voice. "This is our trouble, family trouble." "Your trouble ended 10 minutes ago when I knocked on this door," Elias replied firmly, looking directly into Arthur's dark eyes. "I know about Daisy's injury. I know that you have been fighting alone for 13 years, collecting money for a foreign clinic. I contacted the medical center in Germany." He unbuttoned the inner pocket of his jacket and took out a folded-in-half thick sheet of paper with seals. He put it on the table, pushing it toward Arthur. "Here is the confirmation. I have fully paid the invoice, transport by special flight, the most complex reconstructive surgery on the spine, and 6 months of first-class rehabilitation. The money is already in the clinic's account. In a week, you fly out." A ringing, deafening silence hung in the kitchen. The old refrigerator humming in the corner could be heard. Daisy turned pale. She shifted her wide-open eyes from the paper to Elias's face, refusing to believe in the reality of what was happening. Miracles do not happen. In their harsh world, blown by all winds, everything had to be paid for with sweat and blood. Arthur looked at the document. His eyes were dazzled by a multitude of foreign letters and numbers, but the blue seal was real. The air suddenly became thick and viscous. A tight hot lump formed in Arthur's chest, which rapidly rose to his throat. For 13 years he lived with a sense of impenetrable guilt and despair. For 13 years he forbade himself weakness, forbade himself even to sigh loudly so as not to scare his daughter. He was iron, monolithic, indestructible. And now, from the simple words of this young man, the iron gave a crack. Arthur, a man who did not bend under the weight of factory machines and cruel blows of fate, suddenly lowered his grey head low. His broad shoulders, draped in an old sweater, shook heavily. He covered his face with heavy, calloused palms, hiding his face distorted by a spasm from his daughter and the guest. A hollow, rending sound burst from his chest, like a groan of liberation. Hot moisture burned the coarsened skin of his hands. This was time itself weeping, paying back debts. Daisy turned the wheels of the chair, drove right up to her father and tightly hugged him around the neck, pressing her wet cheek to his grey crown. "Dad, Daddy, we'll go, everything will be fine," she whispered, and for the first time in many years there was not submissiveness to fate in her voice, but real, living faith. Elias silently rose from the table. He went to the window, turning away so as not to embarrass them with his presence. He looked at the dark street where the wind drove dry leaves along the asphalt and felt an old, painful wound from childhood healing in his own soul. The law of justice worked. The boomerang of kindness, launched many years ago in a cold bus, hit exactly the target, piercing the armor of despair. "Flight next Tuesday," Elias said quietly, without turning around. "I will help you with the visa processing and accompany you on the trip. Pack your things, Arthur. The time of miracles is just beginning." The spacious lobby of the Munich clinic was flooded with a steady, ruthlessly white light. It left no shadows, gave no opportunity to hide or cover from intrusive anxiety. The air here smelled differently than in the native Blackwood hospitals. Instead of the pungent smell of chlorine and stale dampness, A thin, almost surgical aroma of ozone and antiseptic soap predominated. The monotonous hum of a powerful ventilation system merged with the quiet rustle of the rubber soles of medical personnel. Arthur sat on a hard plastic chair, his broad palms gripping his own knees tightly. 7 hours had passed since the gurney with Daisy disappeared behind the massive frosted doors of the surgical block. 7 endless drawing hours, each of which exhausted the soul more than a whole week of work in a factory shop for 2 shifts in a row. Nearby, slightly hunched, sat Elias. He wore a soft cashmere sweater of dark grey colour, and an open but long-forgotten laptop lay on his knees. The young man cancelled all his business meetings for this week, entrusting the management of the transport company to his deputies, and flew to Germany together with Arthur and Daisy. "Drink some, Arthur?" Elias handed him a cardboard cup with burning hot coffee. The drink emitted a tart, bitter aroma of over-roasted beans. "You need strength." Dr. Krause warned that spinal reconstruction is a long process. Arthur mechanically took the cup. The warmth of the cardboard slightly warmed his frozen fingers, but the first sip echoed in his mouth with a dry, astringent bitterness. "You know, Elias," Arthur's voice sounded low, with a rasp as if he had been shouting in the cold for a long time. "I actually waited for Clara, my wife, the same way. There behind the door, her fate was being decided, and I sat in the corridor, breathing paint from the walls and praying to all the gods I never believed in. I didn't pray her out." He fell silent, fixing a heavy gaze on the toes of his old but carefully polished boots before the trip. Elias did not interrupt. He felt that the old worker needed to talk, to release the tight spring of guilt that had been rusting inside for decades. "I was actually to blame for everything then myself," Arthur continued, and a hollow hopelessness sounded in his tone. "Clara complained of pains, and I believed her excuses, was afraid to push. And when Daisy was born and Clara left, it's like I went crazy. I decided that now I must control every step of my daughter. Locked her under a glass dome. Thought I would protect her that way. Look how it turned out. The girl broke out into freedom for half an hour, got on that cursed bicycle and under the car. Where it's thin, it breaks, and all of it is my fault. My hyper-protection pushed her under the wheels." Elias closed the laptop. The click of the plastic sounded surprisingly loud in the silence. "Guilt is a bad foundation for life, Arthur. You've spent your whole life trying to pay for what did not depend on you. Clara made her decisions, Daisy hers. You cannot be responsible for the whole world. You did the main thing. You didn't give up. Pulled your daughter out of depression, gave her an education, and now together we will give her the opportunity to walk again." Arthur slowly put his hand into the inner pocket of his jacket, took out a thick, yellowed, sealed envelope. Clara's letter. He brought it with him for thousands of kilometers, still not deciding to open it. "She left me a letter right before the end. I've been carrying it with me for 20+ years through apartments, and I still can't find the heart to read it. I'm afraid there are reproaches there that before she died, she realized what a coward I was for not saving her." Elias looked carefully at the worn paper. "And maybe there are just words of love there? Maybe she asked you to live on and not blame yourself," he asked softly. "Sometimes the most terrible thing is hidden, not in the envelope, but in our own conjectures. You won't know the truth until you read it." Their conversation was interrupted by the quiet buzz of the buzzer over the operating room doors. The red lamp went out, giving way to a soft green glow. The leaves slid apart to the sides, and a tall surgeon in a light blue medical suit came out into the corridor. He was pulling a damp mask off his face, breathing heavily. An interpreter, a tiny woman in strict glasses, followed. Arthur rose abruptly. "Doctor," Arthur exhaled, leaning forward. The doctor said something quickly in German, smiling slightly with the corners of his lips. The interpreter immediately picked up his words. "The operation is completed. 9 hours. Dr. Krause's team did everything possible. We stabilized the vertebrae and freed the pinched nerve endings. The spinal cord has no irreversible damage." Arthur leaned his hand heavily against the wall. The room floated slightly before his eyes. She will be able to walk. It depends on her will and on her persistence in rehabilitation. The woman translated. The architecture of the spine is restored. Now we have to teach the body to listen to the brain again. The patient will spend the next 24 hours in intensive care. Then a long way will begin. The first weeks after the operation resembled a grueling marathon. Daisy's hospital room was filled with the smells of medical talc, warming ointments, and fresh towels. A physiotherapist, a strong German with the hands of a professional wrestler, came twice a day. The classes brought pain, sharp, pulsating, giving into every muscle. Daisy lay on a wide gym mat, clenching her teeth so that her jaws ached. Large, salty sweat rolled down her face. The doctor methodically bent and unbent her legs, forcing the frozen ligaments to work. The girl closed her eyes and imagined that she was building a house. Her spine was the main load-bearing wall. For the building to stand for centuries, the foundation must be poured long and carefully. Every painful movement was a brick in this new, strong foundation. She did not groan. Only occasionally did a short, whistling exhale escape from her chest. Arthur at such moments went out into the corridor, unable to watch his daughter's torment. But Elias stayed. He flew to Munich every second weekend, bringing the aromas of fresh pastries, tart black tea, and rustling rolls of thick drawing paper into the sterile ward. Elias sat nearby on the mat right on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest, and began to tell stories. He spoke about funny incidents in his bus park, about new routes, about how Blackwood is preparing for winter. His calm, confident baritone acted on Daisy better than any painkillers. She concentrated on the sound of his voice, and the pain slowly retreated into the background. On one of the cold December days when large flakes of snow swirled outside the huge window of the ward, the physiotherapist allowed Daisy to move into a chair for a walk through the clinic's winter garden. She and Elias drove out into the glass-enclosed conservatory. The air here was damp, filled with the thick smell of blooming orchids and moist earth. Elias stopped the chair by a small artificial waterfall. The water flowed down the smooth stones with a quiet murmur. The man went around the chair and squatted in front of Daisy. With care, he adjusted the warm woolen plaid on her legs. His hands lingered for a moment on her knees, and Daisy suddenly felt through the fabric of her thick trousers a faint, barely perceptible warmth of his palms. This was the first real physical sensation in her legs in long 13 years. She inhaled convulsively, her eyes wide open. "Elias," her voice trembled. I feel the warmth." He raised his eyes to her. In his dark eyes, reflections of the falling water were reflected, and something so deep, warm, and careful that everything inside her turned over. He did not exult or call the doctors loudly. Elias simply intertwined his fingers with hers, firmly squeezing her palm. "I knew, Daisy. I knew you would manage. You are the strongest architect I have ever met. You were able to rebuild your own destiny." Their faces were very close. In the silence of the conservatory, the murmur of the waterfall seemed like music accompanying the birth of something completely new. Daisy looked at the strong features of Elias's face at the stubborn crease between his eyebrows and realized that this man brought her not just money for treatment, he brought her the returned right to life and to love. The spring of 2016 burst into Munich unexpectedly early, bringing with it the bitter aroma of blooming horse chestnuts and the resonant dripping hitting the tin cornices of the clinic. In the spacious hall of medical physical training, light fell through the panoramic windows, marking the shiny parquet into smooth, golden squares. Daisy stood between parallel bars. Her fingers were gripped deathly to the smooth, cool metal. Under her thin cotton t-shirt, her tensed shoulder blades were clearly visible. She breathed deeply and loudly, drawing in air that smelled of a quartz lamp and fresh cotton towels. "Come on, Daisy, center of gravity forward." The physiotherapist's voice sounded steady, setting a working rhythm. 5 steps away from her, against a white plastered wall, Arthur and Elias froze. Her father leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. Over these 6 months, he had seemingly shed an invisible shell. His shoulders lowered, the sharp wrinkles at his mouth smoothed out, giving way to a soft peacefulness. Daisy transferred her weight to her right leg. The foot in a soft textile sneaker touched the parquet. A quiet rustle of the sole was heard. It was the most deafening sound in the last 14 years. The girl released her left hand from the bars, swayed. The air in the hall became thick, tangible. Elias leaned forward, ready at any second to catch her, but Arthur warningly touched his elbow. The second step was harder. The muscles trembled from the unaccustomed load, but Daisy stubbornly straightened her back. She looked straight ahead to where a glass vase with a branch of Labrador tea stood on the windowsill. 3 steps, 4. Without support, without insurance. Arthur slowly sat on a bench by the wall. He did not utter a word, just breathed frequently and shallowly, looking at his daughter's smooth, confident back. At that moment, he finally believed that his personal war was over. That same evening, when Daisy fell asleep after an exhausting training session, Arthur went out into the hospital square. The wind moved the bare branches of the trees, the air smelled of melting snow and damp bark. The man sat on a wooden bench, took the yellowed envelope out of the inner pocket of his jacket. His fingers no longer trembled. He picked the edge with his fingernail and tore off the flap. The letter was short. The paper retained Clara's smooth, bead-like handwriting. "My dear Arthur, if you are reading this, it means my stupid cowardice has won after all. I am writing and Daisy is sleeping in the next room. You know, in the orphanage, they taught us one terrible thing. If you are weak, they will turn away from you. The sick were returned, the healthy were taken into families. This fear has eaten into my bones deeper than any ailment. I hid the pain from you because I was deathly afraid of seeing exhaustion from me in your eyes. I was afraid of becoming a burden that is carried out of pity. Forgive me for this white lie that saved no one. You gave me the most beautiful years. Do not blame yourself for anything. You were my stone wall. I just turned out to be a bad builder and destroyed our house myself. Grow our girl strong and, I beg you, do not forbid her to live out of fear of losing. Breathe with a full chest, Arthur. I will always look at you through our big windows." Arthur lowered his head. The wind snatched the empty envelope from his hands, rolling it along the wet paving stones, but the elderly man did not rush in pursuit, as if a heavy rusty lock that had hung on his soul for 2 decades had finally fallen off. Clara simply asked him to live. At this time, on the 2nd floor of the clinic, Elias quietly entered Daisy's ward. The girl was not sleeping. She was sitting in bed, surrounded by architectural handbooks. The bedside lamp cast a warm, cozy light on her concentrated face. Drawing again? Elias put a paper bag on the nightstand. Inside, glass jars clinked hollowly. I brought those vitamins that Dr. Krauss prescribed, and something else. He took a thick, glossy album out of the bag. On the cover, Gothic cathedrals and futuristic bridges glittered with gold embossing. Daisy carefully ran her fingers over the smooth cardboard. This is a gift edition on the history of European architecture. Elias, it costs insane money. Why are you spending so much? You have already paid for my resurrection. The man sat on the edge of her bed. The springs of the mattress creaked quietly. He looked at her with a long, attentive gaze in which there was not a drop of pity, only sincere, deep admiration. I am investing in the most promising architect of modern times, he said softly, and a slight irony sounded in his voice, hiding real tenderness. Besides, I need a competent specialist. My company is planning to build a new logistics center near Blackwood, a barrier-free environment, panoramic windows, smooth lines. Will you take on the project? Daisy closed the handbook. Inside her, everything sang from a strange, aching feeling that was much stronger than trivial gratitude. During these long months, Elias became for her not just a savior, he became her main support. Do you pay the advance with albums? She squinted slightly, supporting his game, but the corners of her lips gave away a joyful smile. I pay the advance with my free time. Elias leaned forward. His voice became quieter. How about we go out tomorrow evening, that is, go out on your own feet for dinner? There is an excellent restaurant in town with a view of Marienplatz. No wheelchairs, no hospital walls, just you and me. Daisy looked at her legs, covered with a light blanket. They still obeyed poorly, tired quickly, but they were alive, just like herself. I'll wear a dress, she simply replied, and in this short phrase, the long-awaited consent to a new life sounded. Blackwood met them with thick autumn mists and the damp smell of fallen leaves that tightly covered the sidewalks. The end of 2016 turned out to be damp. The sky over the city hung low, heavy and grey, as if woven from coarse cloth. But for the three people who got out of the warm interior of the car at the old brick house, this day was painted in the brightest tones. Daisy carefully lowered her foot in a leather boot onto the wet asphalt, then the second. In her right hand, a light cane made of dark wood was gripped, a temporary but necessary support. Elias, who went around the car, froze a step away from her, ready to catch her, but the girl stubbornly shook her head. The asphalt under her feet seemed unusually hard, reliable, returning the forgotten sense of gravity. The dull thud of the cane tip against the curb sounded like a victory march in the quiet yard. Arthur stood at the trunk, clutching a travel bag in his hands. He watched as his daughter slowly but surely made independent steps to the entrance. Thick, steady warmth spread in the chest of the elderly man. The letter from Clara read in the Munich square removed the invisible shackles from him. He was no longer a supervisor over his own daughter. He became simply a loving father again. Daisy stopped before the wooden sloping ramp that Arthur had knocked together 13 years ago. The boards had darkened slightly from time and rain. "Shall we take it apart, Dad?" She turned, and a light smile played on her face. Arthur came closer, adjusted the collar of his jacket. "Let it winter over, and in the spring I'll knock a bench for the front garden out of these boards. I'll sit, drink tea, and remember that any wall can be broken through if you want it badly enough." The apartment smelled of long emptiness and a thin layer of dust, but this smell instantly vanished. As soon as Arthur threw open the vents, letting in the fresh wind, life began to boil again, and with an energy never seen before. 2 months later, Daisy finally put the cane aside. Her gait gained a long-awaited lightness. Only in the evening, when the muscles filled with heaviness, did she allow herself to lean slightly on the furniture. During the day, she plunged headlong into work. Stacks of complex drawings now towered on her desk. The project for a new logistics center for Elias's company was born in agony, disputes, and endless remakes. Elias came almost every evening. He brought hot pastries from the bakery on the corner, bringing the aromas of baked apples, cinnamon, and vanilla into the house. They sat at the kitchen table, spread out wide sheets of drawing paper, and the magic began. "Look, Daisy." Elias ran his finger along a blue line on the drawing. In the uneven light of the kitchen lampshade, his profile seemed carved from stone. "If we move the unloading zone here, then the trucks will not intersect with the pedestrian zone of the employees. Safety is above all." Daisy leaned over the table. Her shoulder barely perceptibly touched his shoulder. Elias smelled of frosty air and a barely perceptible tart perfume. Logical. But then we will have to change the angle of inclination of the ramp at the main entrance. I don't want to make steep steps. Architecture should meet a person, not build an obstacle course before them. As you say, Chief Architect. Elias smiled softly, turning his head to her. At such moments, disputes about concrete and glass lost all meaning, giving way to a completely different silent conversation of glances, and in their relationship there was no youthful, feverish haste or dramatic strains. They both went through too harsh trials to waste time on empty games. Their feelings were built as solidly as Daisy's projects. Brick by brick, layer by layer, forming an indestructible monolith. December generously covered Blackwood with fluffy and glittering snow. On one of those evenings when the frost pleasantly nipped the cheeks, Elias invited Daisy to the site of the future construction. They stood on the edge of a huge snow-covered wasteland outside the city limits. The wind fluttered the hem of Daisy's woolen coat. A ringing primal silence reigned around, broken only by the rare hum of cars on a distant highway. "It's cold." Elias stepped toward her, covering her from the gusts of wind. "A little, but the air here is amazing. It smells like the beginning of something big." She hid her frozen hands in her pockets and gazed into the white wasteland where excavators were supposed to roar already in the spring. Elias did not say anything about deadlines or contractors. He took a small velvet box of deep blue color out of the pocket of his cloth coat. The click of the spring sounded surprisingly clear in the frosty silence. Inside, a ring rested on a satin cushion. There was no flashy luxury or screaming stones in it. A graceful band of white gold intertwined in a complex harmonious knot, topped with a clear, transparent diamond. Daisy held her breath. The steam from her intermittent exhale hung in the cold air like a cloud. "We both know the price of a reliable foundation, Daisy." Elias's voice sounded low, vibrating with restrained excitement. "I looked for your father for many years to return the debt for salvation, and I found my own. My life before meeting you was like this wasteland. Successful, large-scale, but absolutely cold. Become my wife. Let's build our house together without thresholds, without barriers, just us." Daisy raised her eyes to him. There were tears in them, but these were bright and warm drops, washing away the last remnants of fear of the future. She took her right hand out of her pocket and pulled off the leather glove. "I agree, Elias. I will design the brightest future for us." He carefully put the ring on her finger. The metal burned her skin with a light chill, which was immediately replaced by the warmth of his palms. Elias hugged her, pressing her to himself. And in this gesture there was such strength and care that Daisy realized she would never have to learn to walk alone again. When they returned home, flushed with frost and happy, Arthur met them in the hallway. He didn't need to explain anything. He saw the glitter on his daughter's hand, saw the calm, mature joy in Elias's eyes, and simply, silently hugged both with his heavy, broad hands. "Well, thank God," the old man just exhaled, hiding his moistening eyes. Waited. The whole rest of the evening passed in joyful, faltering discussions. They drank tea, made plans. Daisy took out calendars. Elias made notes in a notebook. "We need to have a dinner this weekend," Elias said, finishing the cooled tea. "Modest, family style. Arthur, you absolutely need to meet my Aunt Taisia. You have never seen each other after all. She replaced my mother, pulled me out of poverty. If it weren't for her, I would never have become who I am. She insists on meeting the in-law." Arthur nodded sedately, smoothing his beard. "A proper thing. Families should come together. In what order?" "Let her come. I'll bake my signature meat pie. In my youth, I remember the whole plant praised it." He said this easily, not yet guessing that the upcoming weekend would prepare a surprise not only for the young, but for himself as well. By Saturday evening, Arthur's old apartment was filled with thick, savory aromas. That same signature meat pie was browning in the oven, the recipe for which the old worker kept in the strictest secret from all factory cooks. It smelled of baked dough, simmered onions, and generously sprinkled black pepper. Arthur stood at the sink frantically, rubbing the crystal glasses remaining since the time of his youth with a hard waffle towel. He wore a light, carefully ironed shirt, the collar of which slightly rubbed his neck, unaccustomed to formal clothing. At 6 o'clock in the evening, a short, delicate knock sounded in the hallway. Daisy, stepping lightly on the wooden floorboards, every independent step of hers still echoed in her father's soul, with a quiet and triumphant song, went to open it. The lock clicked. A frosty freshness blew from the landing. "Good evening" to the hosts. A resonant, surprisingly young female voice was heard in the corridor, in which natural intelligence was unmistakably guessed. Arthur put down the towel and came out of the kitchen, adjusting his shirt as he went. Next to high, as always, impeccably dressed Elias, stood a woman. Taisia was about 55 years old. She did not try to look young. Her thick hair, touched with noble silver, was styled in an elegant knot at the back of the head. A light silk scarf of a deep emerald shade was thrown over her shoulders, which in a surprising way emphasized the lively shine of her hazel eyes. She smelled faintly of powder and some strict, classic perfumes, an aroma of theatre premieres and old libraries. "Come in, dear guests, you are welcome." Arthur bowed slightly, inviting them into the room. His low, thick bass in the presence of this woman suddenly sounded softer than usual. Taisia held out her hand to him. Her palm was narrow, cool, with thin, long fingers, but the grip turned out to be surprisingly strong, confident. "Taisia, I've heard much about you, Arthur." She squinted slightly, studying his face. In her gaze, there was neither the arrogance of a city dweller nor the condescension of a wealthy relative, only a sincere, deep interest. "Elias has buzzed my ears about the person who gave him faith in people for a modest $50. Arthur chuckled good-naturedly, hiding his embarrassment behind his thick mustache. "Oh, enough of that, a thing of the past. You better come to the table. The pie is cooling." The dinner proceeded in that rare and amazing atmosphere when strangers by blood tune in to one invisible frequency from the first minutes. The yellow light of the crystal chandelier softly outlined the faces of those gathered. Forks clinked strongly brewed tea with currant leaves, which Arthur himself gathered at a factory friend's cottage, cooled in cups. Taisia tried a piece of pie and closed her eyes with pleasure. Stupendous, weightless dough. "You know, Arthur, I've worked as an editor in a publishing house my whole life, correcting other people's texts, searching for ideal forms. But I've always had a difficult relationship with cooking. As Leo Tolstoy wrote, all happy families are alike, and I will add, and they all know how to bake such pies. Mine always burns on the bottom. Arthur laughed, sincerely, resoundingly. The secret is simple. You have to feel the temperature. Don't look at the degrees on the handle, but with your hand. When the heat becomes even, then put it in. I'll teach you if there is a desire. Elias and Daisy looked at each other. They sat side by side, barely touching each other with their shoulders, and silently watched the older generation. Daisy saw how her father was transformed. The multi-year weight that had eaten into his back left his posture. He enthusiastically talked about the subtleties of leather dressing, peppered his speech with his favorite proverbs, and Taisia listened to him, her chin propped on her hand, and sparkles danced in her eyes. When Elias and Daisy went out to the balcony to discuss the details of the upcoming registration, a cozy, trustful silence reigned in the kitchen. The old refrigerator hummed. Taisia carefully folded the linen napkin. "You have a good girl, Arthur," she said quietly, looking at the dark glass of the balcony door. "Bright?" I was actually very afraid for Elias. He is a tough, businesslike guy, keeps everything to himself, but he thawed out with her. "You're right." Arthur leaned his elbows heavily on the table. I actually shook over Daisy like over a crystal vase. I didn't give her a life, was always afraid of losing. If it weren't for your nephew, we would have rotted within 4 walls. Taisia nodded understandingly. The ironic spark in her eyes went out, giving way to a hidden sadness. Fear for a child is the most terrible tyrant. I actually took Elias in when he was 10 years old. My sister, may she rest in peace, went completely to the bottom. I was young then, my career had just started to go uphill. There was a fiancé, and then a strange, prickly wolf cub who flinches at every loud sound and hides bread under his pillow. I had to choose. The fiancé left, said, "He doesn't need other people's problems." And I stayed with Elias. Put all of myself into him, never regretted it, but... She fell silent, adjusting the edge of the silk scarf. Arthur looked closely at her. But now he has grown up, the old worker finished for her quietly. The nest is emptying, and the silence in the apartment in the evenings is such that you could howl like a wolf. Familiar? Oh, how familiar, Taisia. The woman raised her eyes to him, and at that moment, a strong, inextricable thread of mutual understanding stretched between them. They both gave their best years, sacrificed personal happiness for the sake of putting these two on their feet, who were now laughing carelessly on the balcony, watching the falling snow. They paid their debts to fate in full, and now a frightening but tempting void of freedom opened before them. "You know, Arthur?" Taisia suddenly smiled softly, and this smile made her face surprisingly young and defenseless. "At the Blackwood Drama Theatre next weekend, they are giving The Cherry Orchard. I have 2 tickets. Elias refused to go, said that Chekhov makes him melancholic. Will you keep me company? I promise not to quote the classics too often." Arthur felt a warm, forgotten lump of embarrassment mixed with joy rise to his throat. He rubbed his dry palm against his knee, smoothing out an invisible crease on his trousers. "To the theatre? I haven't been there for 40 years. Ever since I came from Little Springs. Aren't you afraid that I'll shame you before the theatre-goers in a suit from someone else's shoulder?" "Not at all," Taisia replied firmly. "Real nobility, Arthur. It's not in the suit, it's in the actions. I'll be waiting for you at the columns at exactly 7. Pre-wedding chores whirled them in a tight, joyful whirlpool. The days flew by unnoticed, filled with choosing fabric for the dress, approving guest lists, and arguing about the menu. Daisy sewed the dress herself according to her own sketch, elegant, straight cut from thick ivory silk. It flowed softly over her figure, emphasizing the fragility of her shoulders and a confident, smooth posture. No corsets restricting breathing, only freedom of movement. 2 days before the registration, Arthur went into his daughter's room. Daisy stood before a tall, full-length mirror, trying on the finished outfit. On the nightstand lay that same box in which Clara's letter had been kept for 20+ years. Now the box was open, and old photographs lay at its bottom. Her father stopped in the doorway. The setting spring sun hit the window, flooding the room with a thick, honey light. Dust motes danced slowly in the golden rays. Daisy turned to him. In this light, she was strikingly similar to her mother. The same soft line of cheekbones, the same light halo of hair. But the look was different. There was no sacrifice or fear of the future in it. An indestructible, calm strength was read in it. "Well, how is it, Dad?" She ran her hands over the smooth fabric of the dress, waiting for his verdict. Arthur swallowed a tight lump, came closer, and cautiously kissed her on her high, clear forehead. She smelled of spring, freshness, and new life. "Mother would be proud of you, Daisy. You didn't just stand on your feet, you flew. Fly, daughter, and fear nothing. Your foundation is now more reliable than the Kremlin wall." Daisy tightly hugged her father. They stood in the silence of the room, listening to the first spring birds chirping outside. The time of losses had irretrievably passed. Ahead of them lay only a day filled with light, the clinking of glasses, and the triumph of justice, which sometimes still happens in this harsh but beautiful world. The end of May generously gifted Blackwood with early resonant warmth. The suburban restaurant chosen by Elias for the celebration stood on a high bank of the river. The building of light stone and glass seemed to hover over the water. Huge panoramic windows were wide open, letting in the thick honey aroma of blooming apple trees and the fresh breath of the river breeze. In the spacious hall, a string quartet played, filling the space with soft, shimmering sounds of cello and violins. Arthur sat at a round table covered with a heavy, snow-white tablecloth. The old man's fingers slowly rotated a crystal glass of mineral water covered with beads of cold condensation. The old worker, accustomed to the roar of factory machines and cramped small apartments, felt for the first time in his life at home among this ringing luxury. He wore a perfectly tailored dark grey suit that Elias insisted on having made to order by the best tailor. The soft wool did not restrict movement, and the starched collar of the light shirt gave Arthur's face a solemn, noble strictness. He looked into the centre of the hall. There, in the rays of the setting sun, the newlyweds were dancing. Daisy moved easily, like a down feather caught by a spring wind. The thick silk of her dress built a waterfall, repeating every curve of her slender figure. No constraint, no uncertainty in her steps. The girl laughed, throwing her head back, and all this huge, newly found world was reflected in her deep, dark eyes. Elias carefully held her by the waist. In his gaze fixed on his wife, there was such an indestructible devotion and strength that Arthur finally realized his daughter was under the most reliable protection that can only be found on this earth. "Admiring?" a soft, chesty voice sounded nearby. Arthur turned his head. Taisia gracefully sank onto the next chair. Today she chose a dress of a deep wine shade, which in a surprising way harmonized with the silver of her highly styled hair. She emitted a thin scent of freesia and something invisibly warm, cozy. "Admiring, Taisia?" The old man squared his broad shoulders, leaning back against the chair. I'm looking at them and I can't believe it. For 14 years, every morning I woke up with one thought. How can I live this day so that Daisy doesn't notice my anxiety? Lived like in a minefield. A step to the left, a step to the right, fear. And now, look, they are flying, flapping their wings, and the sky above them is clear. Taisia leaned toward him slightly, placing her narrow palm over his large, calloused hand, resting on the armrest. The touch was light, but it contained the huge support of a person who had known similar hardships. You have earned this peace, Arthur. You have raised a wonderful woman and didn't just save her, but allowed her to become herself. You know, in that play we watched last week, in the cherry orchard, Arthur picked up with a smile, recalling their joint trip to the theatre, which had become a real revelation for him. Yes, there is a beautiful, though bitter, thought there that the old must give way to the new. You and I, Arthur, have been gardeners in other people's gardens for a long time. I raised Elias, you protected Daisy. We forgot about ourselves so they could bloom, but now their garden has grown. And our trees are still strong. In their shadow, one can still live long and happily. Arthur looked closely into her lively, intelligent eyes. Over these few months, their communication had grown from timid phone calls into a deep, mature affection. They walked along the embankment, drank tea with time for long evenings, discussed books they read, and just kept silent, as only people who don't need to prove anything to each other can keep silent. I was thinking, Taisia. Arthur's voice became quieter, almost intimate, muffled by the overflows of the violin. I've decided to sell my apartment. Daisy and Elias are moving into a new house that she designed herself, and I have nothing to do alone in that place. It's heavy there, too many shadows. Taisia held her breath. With a graceful gesture, she adjusted a stray napkin, trying to hide sudden excitement. And where do you plan to move? Will you buy a house in the suburbs? In the suburbs, it's lonely alone. Arthur squinted slightly, and kind rays of wrinkles gathered at the corners of his eyes. I've looked at an apartment in the centre, next to your publishing house. There's a wide balcony, one can grow geraniums, and the theatre is a 10-minute walk away, if of course you agree to continue enlightening the old factory worker. And on weekends, we will bake pies together. I promise to teach you how to measure the temperature in the oven with your hand. The woman laughed quietly, melodically. In this laughter there was neither coquetry nor falsehood, only the sincere, bright joy of a woman who finally allowed herself simple human happiness. I'll hold you to your word, Arthur. Pies are a serious argument. At that moment, the music died down. A light ring sounded. Elias struck the edge of a crystal glass several times with a dessert spoon, calling the guests to silence. Conversations at the tables ceased. The young man stood in the center of the hall, hugging his wife by the shoulders. Daisy glowed from within. Her cheeks were slightly flushed from the dance. Dear guests, Elias's voice, accustomed to giving clear orders in the office, now sounded warm and excited. Today the people closest to us are gathered here. Daisy and I want to say thank you to each of you, but my main toast today is for the person without whom there would be no this evening, no my company, no myself. Arthur. Elias raised his glass, fixed his gaze directly on the old man. A solemn silence hung in the hall. Only the river wave lazily beating against the stone parapet of the terrace could be heard. 21 years ago, in a damp evening bus, one worker, tired after a shift, did not turn away from a strange, hungry boy. He gave him his last $50 and a piece of bread. This bread saved me. This money became my first capital, the capital of faith that the world does not consist of indifference alone. You taught me the main law of business, Arthur. The most reliable investments are kindness. It always returns. Let it be through years, let it be through other ways, but it finds its way home for you, Father. The guests rose from their seats together. Glasses clinked. Sincere applause broke out. Daisy looked at her father, and a transparent drop slowly rolled down her cheek, which she immediately brushed away with a joyful smile. Arthur rose heavily from the table. He leaned his hands on the tabletop, feeling a hot, powerful wave spreading inside. He looked at Elias, at the shining Daisy, at Taisia, who looked at him with unconcealed admiration. "Thank you, son." Arthur's bass trembled, but immediately strengthened, filling the entire hall. "I am a simple man, not taught to speak speeches. I worked with my hands all my life, but one thing I understood firmly: life is like a construction site. Daisy won't let me lie. One can pour a foundation of fear and resentment, erect blank walls and sit behind them, trembling at every rustle, or one can build from love and forgiveness, forgive oneself for past mistakes, forgive those who left before their time, and leave wide doors in this house so that good people have something to enter through." He paused, looking around the bright hall. In his memory for a moment flashed Clara's face, not distorted by pain, as in those terrible March days of '92, but clear, calm, with her signature apologetic half-smile. He seemed to hear her whisper, "Breathe with a full chest, Arthur," and the old man obeyed. He inhaled the air of the spring evening deeply, with a full chest. "You and Daisy have built a wonderful house, Elias. In it, there are no high thresholds and narrow stairs. It's easy to breathe in it. Take care of each other. And remember, whatever happens, however destiny twists, share your bread. The boomerang always returns." For the young couple. Arthur drained the glass to the bottom. The vine of the grape, which had absorbed the sun of distant southern valleys, burned the palate with a pleasant tartness. Later, when it got dark and balls of festive fireworks blossomed in the sky over the river, scattering myriads of golden sparks, Arthur went out to the open terrace. The night coolness pleasantly refreshed his face. The old man leaned on the stone railings, gazing into the dark surface of the water in which flashes of fireworks were reflected. Nearby, Taisia approached soundlessly. She threw her emerald scarf over her shoulders. Arthur silently took off his jacket and threw it over her back, sheltering her from the river dampness. She nodded gratefully, moving closer. Their shoulders touched. "They fly beautifully," she said quietly, looking at the sparks fading in the sky. "They fly," Arthur echoed. He stood on the high bank, feeling the solid ground under his feet. For the first time in many decades, there was neither a stone of guilt nor a sucking feeling of anxiety in his chest. Arthur let go of his pain. He had paid all the bills honestly and in full. Ahead of him lay a calm, bright autumn of life, filled with the smell of geraniums on the balcony of a new apartment, the rustle of theatre programs, and the quiet, cozy laughter of the woman standing right now next to him. The boomerang, launched in the cold Blackwood bus, described a huge arc through years, tears, despair, and faith, to finally return back and lie right in the open, calloused palms of the old worker. To return not with money, but with the saved life of his daughter and the found light of his own soul. Did this story about forgiveness, selflessness, and the invisible threads of destiny connecting us to each other touch you? Do you believe that sincere kindness always returns in the most needed moments of life? Share your thoughts in the comments, like this video, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new, deep, and vital stories. There are still many important topics for the soul ahead.